Me quiero asegurar de
We're going to begin. I do want to remind folks, well, let me start by introducing myself. I am Dr. Kyra Greene. I am the Executive Director at the Center on Policy Initiatives. We are an affiliate of the Partnership for Working Families, and we are located in San Diego, California, in Kumeyaay land. I'm going to give you a quick reminder that we do have this event. We are giving this event in 2 languages. So because we have interpreters, we're asking folks so that it's accessible to everyone, if you could not use the chat for just regular conversation so that we can all be part of one conversation. And we'll use our chat space later for questions in English and in Spanish, and then those will be repeated out loud. I'll give a little overview of how we'll spend our day together. I'm going to start with intros of our amazing panelists. I am so honored to be here with them today and to get in the fray with them. I'll also try to remember that my job is to moderate and not just be a participant, awed by their brilliance, although I will be. Then we'll do some intros of them. We'll move to some questions for each of them, and we'll do some panel discussion, and then we'll open it up to your questions from everyone attending today. So just to get started, let me tell you about the amazing folks who are with us today. First of all, I'd like to introduce Dr. Nancy MacLean. She is the William H. Chafe Distinguished Professor of History and Public Policy at Duke University. She's an award-winning scholar of the 20th century US, whose new book, Democracy in Chains: The Deep History of the Radical Right's Stealth Plan for America, has been described by Publishers Weekly as a thoroughly researched and gripping narrative and a feat of American intellectual and political history. Booklist called it perhaps the best explanation to date of the roots of the political divide that threatens to irrevocably alter American government. This book is a finalist for the National Book Award in Nonfiction. It won the Los Angeles Times Book Prize in Current Interest, the Lannan Foundation Cultural Freedom Award, and the Lillian Smith Book Award. We are honored to have Dr. Nancy MacLean with us today. And I'll just say another award for this book, it's our next panelist that I'm going to introduce, Lauren Jacobs. It's one of her favorite books. So that speaks broadly because she is well-read and brilliant and thoughtful. Dr. Lauren Jacobs is the executive director, I'm handing out titles today, is the executive director at the Partnership for Working Families. Lauren comes to the partnership with a long experience in organizing for over 20 years, organizing folks all over the country with Unite in the South, and later she joined SEIU. During her 17 years at SEIU, she served in a number of roles, from organizer to first vice president. And over the time that she spent organizing, she organized thousands of previously non-union janitors and security workers in 3 metropolitan areas. Her most recent work before coming to the partnership was with Restaurant Opportunity Centers United. Lauren is a consummate organizer. She organizes us. She brings us years of experience and brilliance. She is also a native New Yorker, even though she's much too polite often for you to believe it. And she is an amazing, maybe we'll even get to see her talk to us about her crocheting at some point in this meeting, all the ways that she's a well-rounded human being. And finally, I will introduce Odessa Kelly. Odessa is a native of Nashville. She attended Stratford High School, and then upon graduation, she went to Tennessee State University. Tennessee girls have to stick together. Born in Memphis over here. Odessa holds a master's degree in public service from Cumberland University. And before becoming the executive director of Stand Up Nashville, she built a career in the public sector, being a civil servant for Parks and Rec for 14 years. This work is still close to Odessa's heart. She shares insights from it often with us, especially her work at Napier Community Center. Odessa is an award winner. She is a trailblazer. You know this because she won the 2019 National Eleanor Roosevelt Legacy Award. And she is also a leader inside of this network. She brings us brilliance and hard work. So I'm gonna, with those introductions, nothing could do justice the way that hearing from these folks themselves will do. Before I turn to them, I'm going to do a little bit of framing about the moment we find ourselves in. So right now in this country, we see more and more removal of basic democratic tools from our communities. There are increasing restrictions on voting rights. restrictions on protest, and we see state preemption of cities and local governments. What's important to know about preemption of all of these restrictions is that ultimately they serve the purpose of shoring up white supremacy. If you understand that our country is rooted in white supremacy and the status quo is that, then opportunities, interventions that seek to turn back the tide of change or to stop it, ultimately build the foundation of white supremacy. While that's happening, we also see that corporate actors have access to democracy, and it's more open access to democracy, and they can shape government policies in ways that benefit them. Meanwhile, people of color and other working people who are organizing for better working and living conditions do not enjoy that same access to power, even though they work and struggle and organize for it. Underneath that contradiction creates one of the biggest challenges to organizing and to maintaining social justice movements. Because if people are speaking and raising their voices, but not seeing that reflected, what they ultimately experience is that people in power are not accountable to the public. But what I love about being part of the Partnership for Working Families, nope. Yes. What I love about this work is that we don't just talk about the challenges. We recognize that challenges represent opportunities. We can harness the momentum of this moment. What we see is some of the largest organizing for racial justice in the history of this country is happening right now. And we also have a pandemic that has taken a great bit from all of us, and some of us more than others. But this pandemic also has highlighted the importance of support and care for people in their everyday lives and the role that institutions can play in helping to build strong and healthy communities. We've also seen people organizing for progressive ballot measures that passed across the country and other actions in November that show that people want policies for them and for their communities. Things like paid family leave in Colorado, or decriminalizing drug possession and therefore minimizing the chance that people will interact with the prison industrial complex. So this conversation takes place in this moment of challenge and opportunity, and it brings together analysis from two reports. One, the partnership's report on corporate interference, that I could summarize something like this. The report looks behind the phenomenon that is state preemption, where state legislatures block localities from doing things like raising the minimum wage or passing rent control, to show that what causes those blocks is actually a massive corporate challenge that is part of sweeping deregulation at every level of government, and thus can be labeled corporate interference. This report lays bare the harm that this agenda does to the women, people of color, LGBTQ folks who have been working in their cities and towns to win critical changes like wage increases and affordable housing. The second report looks at people-powered budgets. This report argues that to beat back the threat of white nationalism and austerity, this idea that we simply don't have enough, we must attend to building more inclusive, robust, democratic processes that center equity, and in addition to fighting for particular policy outcomes. And we can do that work by starting with democratizing budgets at the local level. Local budgets are local government is closest to the people, and it's the places where people's voices are most easily heard. It goes beyond simply the current participatory budgeting processes that only engage a very small, pre-allocated portion of the budget, and instead gives people power over all of the resources that belong to their local governments. So this is an opportunity to grow our movement and to grow our work. So this conversation, you'll see, will range from the local and small experiments that folks are doing to the big picture of how we make change at a systemic level. I'm going to stop talking, and I'm going to open this up to our panelists. I'd like to start, Lauren, with a question to you. Can you talk a little bit about how the problem of corporations having disproportionate power in government connects to regular people's suffering and struggles day to day?
Um, Thank you, Kyra. And thank you to everybody that's here with us, listening and looking forward to hearing the questions. And I'm excited to hear from this amazing panel. Yes, it's true. I have cheerleaded and encourage everybody I know to read Democracy in Chains, and encourage everybody on this call, if you have not, you need to read it. I want to say, I think understanding the corporate agenda and its harm on our communities, on our neighbors, on our coworkers, on our families, is a bit like how I think about how, when I was a young organizer, I came to understand how oppressive work was in all the ways. So I remember first organizing, maybe starting with one distribution center that I was assigned as a new organizer to be on, and go out and do, door knocks and build committees in a certain section of the shop, and hearing all the horror stories and all the daily humiliations and the lack of safety, the lack of care and concern for people as whole people rather than as tools for the company. And I remember thinking, oh, that employer is a really bad employer. And then I went to my second campaign, and lo and behold, the stories were very similar. And then the third and the fourth and the fifth. And at some point, you start to see that this isn't about individuals being bad. This is about a system that is designed to squeeze and extract all it can from folks. And I think we have to see this in the same way, writ large, of how corporations have burrowed into the center of governance. One could actually argue, I wouldn't say it's a new phenomenon. It's probably been consistent since the founding of the country, and since the first decisions to start with a massive campaign of exterminating indigenous people and enslaving kidnapped Africans, right? That is, in essence, you start to see even in the founding of like how corporate or how large rich people are making decisions over at the harm of many, over how governance is set. But you definitely see this in the present era. I mean, I think we cannot enter this conversation and not acknowledge that over 500,000 people lost their lives in the spans of 14 months. And why? Because the the wealthy and the powerful in this country did not want to cease, do not want to like, if we think about what would have been the most logical thing to do that would have saved lives, would have been to put the economy in a deep freeze, pay everybody to stay home, get the infection rates down. Why didn't that happen? Who benefited from the decision not to do that? We can look at that 650 billionaires in this country are $1 trillion wealthier, while we lost 600,000 members of our families, our communities, our neighbors, right? I know that each of us can also look at the economic toll that's happening. We know in our communities, in our neighborhoods, in our coworkers who are facing evictions at this moment, almost 30 million people. We know that in this country that there are 28 million folks that are uninsured, right? Who did not have health insurance in the middle of a pandemic. That we know that there are 25 million who go hungry every day in the richest country on the planet. So, looking at those things, you can't, all those, and I could keep going on all of this, but you can't say that those are accidents or individual things that are happening. That is an agenda that's being driven. And I know Nancy will talk a lot more about the dynamics of this and how it works, but we have to see it as an agenda, and it has real world consequences for people that we know and care for, and that we all, I think everybody on this panel centers in terms of either our work as organizers or our work as members of the community that are striving to improve things. So, the thing I'm most excited about in this conversation is that we're sort of peeling back the mask of this, of looking at why do we have 21 states in the country where the minimum wage is set at $7.25, a wage that we know nobody can survive on. Like, nobody's making a debate that you can survive on that in any city or large metro region, right? But yet and still, that's the federal minimum wage that has not gone up in close to 20 years, right? We have a system in which we have continued to wreak havoc on public education. Last I know, most family, like the vast majority of us cannot afford to send our kids to like the fanciest private schools. We do depend on public education, but against our will. We have the stripping and the move to privatize huge sections of it. And then we also know that in terms of looking at the environment and care for the planet that we all exist on, it is not logical to say, yes, let's poison the air, let's poison the seas, let's poison the land, and let's put our species at the brink of extinction through depleting all of the natural resources. But yet and still, that is held. We have a public debate in government, which goes against all common sense, right? Because of corporate power sitting in the middle of it, about whether or not it makes sense to save the planet or to continue and allow industry to pollute and put people at risk. And I want to say it's not only extinction of planet. We know about the unbelievable toll, especially in Black and Latina communities, of asthma rates, which are deadly, right? People die as a result of that are from the pollution that is happening. So I do think in this conversation, there's the bad, and we have to recognize and say, yes, there's an agenda. It's not imagined. It's not by accident. It's not one or two, right? There are, tables where people sit together and come together. There are, think tanks where resources are pooled to change how we all frame these issues and think about them. And I think I'm really excited about that we're having a conversation which is provoked by the democracy, by the people-powered budgets as well, that we are talking about how do we as well have an agenda that is as ambitious, as comprehensive about changing the dynamics of government, and being honest to saying our job isn't to just share power, we want the majority to be the power. Corporations exist because of us, we do not exist for them. And so we need to flip the script on this and restore power to people.
See, I already did it. I forgot that I was the moderator. I was like, I want to just clap. There were so many amazing things in there. I want to get this conversation started, Dr. MacLean, by turning to you, Nancy, and asking you to talk about the intersections you see between the stealth tactics of the libertarian intellectuals that you articulate in Democracy in Chains and the corporate interference that's detailed in our report at PWF.
Apparently the most frequently used words of the last year have been, you're on mute. Anyway, I am delighted to be with you all. First of all, let me thank you all for your work and Lauren for inviting me to this critical conversation. I've been thinking about this issue of preemption since Democracy in Chains, and we're seeing it as a problem in more and more places. So you asked about how the report, this fantastic report, Unmasking Corporate Influence or Interference rather, relates to Democracy in Chains. I think one way to express it is that it's exhibit A of what's happening now with the effort to enchain democracy by the corporate radical right. So in that book, I just, very kind of thumbnail summary, by a quirky path that went through segregation and civil rights era Virginia, I ended up happening upon two really important individuals for our moment. One was the first US Southerner to win the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences for ideas that he developed in the course of the fight against the New Deal and Brown versus Board of Education. The second figure was Charles Koch, the fossil fuel-based multi-billionaire who has convened hundreds of like-minded arch-right donors to change the politics of our country, and particularly in their own terms to enchain democracy. That's essentially what they're seeking to do, not through a coup, but through a radical, systematic rewriting of the rules at every level, federal, state, and local. So over the decades, really, they've been working at this for more than 60 years, but particularly in recent years, we have seen more and more aggressive rigging of the rules. So we see that, for example, with the attacks on labor unions, particularly public sector unions. We see that with all the states that have tried to suppress the vote and are still trying to suppress the vote. We see that in the radical redistricting, the gerrymandering that the Republican Party, which is captured by these donors, but the radical redistricting to over-represent rural, conservative, white interests and underrepresent urban, multiracial, progressive interests. So what we're talking about here today with preemption is really, again, a kind of case study of this larger attempt by the right to shackle democracy. And I think the single most important thing to keep in mind in all of this, and what I see as my most important research findings in Democracy in Chains, is to see them saying again and again, in their own words, they recognize that theirs is a tiny minority agenda, that almost no one in the country would want the world they're trying to bring into creation, right? A world where everything is privatized, where you don't have Social Security, you don't have public education. You know, I could go on and on about what they're trying to create, but it's a radical right vision and they know it, and that is why they have to rig the rules. So to bring this to the specific topic of preemption, which you expose so well in this report, Unmasking Corporate Interference, here's the situation. Thanks for the hard work, everybody, with 2020, won the White House, right? And won control of Congress. And God bless all those people who did the turnout in Georgia, now, are able to think about significant national legislation. But the Republicans still control 30 state legislatures, which they're using to flex their power over progressive cities and towns. So what the Partnership for Working Families is talking about in this Unmasking Corporate Interference report is preemption laws. And these preemption laws are a premier example of how the corporate right is rigging the rules against the majority, using a strategy that leverages the power of legislators from conservative, white, rural districts to overpower progressive, multiracial urban majorities. So this is really a cold-eyed way to get that minority rule for corporations and for white conservative interests. So it is a power grab that's designed to deny municipal governments the right to make their own policies on matters that in past years, decades, generations have been within their purview. And it is a strategy pushed by organizations that some of you will already know well, the American Legislative Exchange Council, ALEC, and the State Policy Network, which are basically these Koch-funded, donor-funded policy advocacy groups across the states, but also your report, and this is another thing that makes it so interesting, you bring in new actors that weren't part of my story in Democracy in Chains, like Uber, and some of these these gig economy actors actually have their roots in the Democratic Party. So the whole situation is getting more complicated, but it's very much a corporate control strategy. So why are they doing this? Why are they pushing these preemption laws to keep local communities from being able to decide basically exercise local control, because the right has had a really significant realization. Grover Norquist, you may know him from Americans for Tax Reform, said back in 2008, when this was all getting going, he explained to allies on the right why it was a great strategy to use preemption because, and I quote, states have even more power over cities than the federal government has over states. So that's important also because the right understands that corporate and conservative interests can capture state legislatures much more easily than they can capture local governments or federal governments, which many more people pay attention to and hold accountable. A recent report by the Center for Public Integrity found that virtually every state government, in their words, is a quote, kowtows to business and the wealthy, ill represents citizens of lesser means, lacks transparency, and poorly enforces ethics laws. So if you know your US history, if you remember, states' rights was the big battle cry of the slaveholders, in the run up to the Civil War, and it remained the battle cry of the Jim Crow states that practiced a form of racial capitalism, where they kept Black voters from participating in government so that they could do what they wanted, these alliances of white legislators and corporations. So what we're seeing today in these preemption efforts is that this Republican Party, which has been taken over by the combination of the corporate donors and the arch right base, they are coercing city and suburban governments where the majority of state residents live by denying their citizens the right to raise local minimum wages, to protect the environment with things like, plastic bag ordinances, to protect public health with tobacco smoking policies or sugary drinks measures, or to enact anti-discrimination measures that would protect LGBTQ citizens. So I think it's important to note that tobacco companies were among the first to practice this preemption strategy because they wanted to keep putting out a product that they knew was addictive and knew harmed people, and cities were pushing back. So they started doing this in earnest, and then the wider corporate right picked this up. But so, they've used it in Birmingham, Alabama, where the city adopted a minimum wage ordinance. The state said they couldn't do it. They preempted it. In Charlotte, North Carolina, where I live, there was a measure to protect transgender citizens, and the state government overruled it. They were also overruling the ability of local governments to deal with wages and set living wages in the course of that, using culture wars to get to keep their poverty producing wage limits in place. But you also show in your report how in Pennsylvania, they've been using preemption to stop local rent control measures. In Florida, Philadelphia, and Pittsburgh, where gun restrictions were adopted after massacres that are only too much in our memories, the state governments prevented them from doing that local gun restriction measures. And we saw in the pandemic, Governor Abbott of Texas was preventing local communities from enforcing their mask wearing ordinances. So on virtually every issue that matters to people's lives, from healthcare to education to rent to disease protection, to so many things, we're seeing these state governments clobber local self-government. And in the name of liberty, because so many of these guys are libertarians, these white guys who are pushing this stuff, it's overwhelmingly white men. In the name of liberty, the city residents are being told that they have to obey the edicts of state government. So I think there's something to notice here in conclusion that I think we could also lift up more maybe in the messaging about all of this, because I think it shocks a lot of people in a good way. But that is that conservatives are always telling us, and libertarians are always telling us, that they support states' rights because they think that they support states' rights against the federal government because they think power should be held close to the people. But when you look at preemption,
I'm so sorry, Dr. MacLean. I just want to make sure if you could just slow down just a little bit. We want to get every word, and these are gems that you're giving us. So if you just slow just a little bit.
I'm so sorry for the translators. I'm in my classes, I have to tell the students to like wave if I'm going too fast, because I do have a tendency to talk fast. So I am sorry, but I'm wrapping up too. But I think this point is really important, that through preemption, we see that the political right doesn't want to limit government power, doesn't want small government. What they want is government that they can control so that it serves corporate interests. And they will clobber local autonomy and the desires of the vast majority of voters if they have to in order to achieve this power. So it's a really significant issue, and it's so helpful and important that you produce this report. I think we'll certainly want to talk in the discussion about what can be done. And some places have tried to repeal preemption laws. So the Working Families Party in Colorado won repeal of a minimum wage preemption law in 2018 in the House. I don't remember if the Senate ever backed that, but that would be one approach. There's also a number of different organizations that are dealing with preemption in different ways, in addition to the Partnership for Working Families. So in the public interest, Local Progress, the National League of Cities, the National Employment Law Project, the Los Angeles Alliance for the New Economy, Grassroots Change, and People's Action. And other people are writing about this, the Center for Media and Democracy, through PR Watch, Facing South. So I think this report is going to be incredibly important to get to the widest variety of actors who are concerned with this, because it really is a fundamental challenge to democracy, to the idea that we, the people, have the right to self-government. And I am thrilled that you are challenging this and exposing it, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that. You took such an amazing amount of material and gave us just gems of wisdom and knowledge. Speaking of gems, I'm going to turn to my sister Odessa and ask you, in the face of these critiques, right, this set of challenges, talk to me about what kinds of campaigns around corporate interference you have found to be most effective. And in particular, can you talk to us about, like, why is organizing so important here?
Sure. First of all, hello everyone that's on the panel, that's joining us. Glad you came in today. That was great, Lauren. Everything that you said. Nancy, it's dope. I don't know why they got me on this panel with y'all. I was Googling big words a second ago. I was gonna drop them on y'all, but I don't know what they mean. So I'm just gonna talk normal with y'all. So everything that I say, give me the credit for it. If it's wrong, blame Lauren and them because they taught me. So just letting y'all know that off the bat. As far as organizing is the way that we have to go, because you don't want the alternative. The alternative is not good for anyone. That's the reason why I started organizing. I started out in the streets, and if you're in the streets, that's a reaction. It's needed. It's important. That's what we get to give our frustration and our outrage and channel that in a way that people understand that whatever's happening is not right. But it's also not the answer. You have to be solution oriented. You have to find ways to actually solve these problems. And that's also maturity in organizing, right? And so, organizing through corporate structures or trying to organize against them is the only route that we have, because we're not going to be oppressed forever. It's going to stop one way or the other. So we can pick a way that's going to work for everybody, or we're going to pick a way, that is... that we all gonna have issues with. But whatever's gonna happen is gonna have an end date. So that's the reason why organizing is important. Mostly we need to remember that. I think the most effective way that we have organized against corporate structures is through public policy and through elected officials, building power and leverage against them, and the autonomy that they hold to regulate these corporations has been the best thing that we've done so far. We've tried all different types of ways. Along with that, I would say too, with popular education, because people just don't know. If y'all don't know, I'm from Nashville, Tennessee. I'm down here in the South. Everything that Nancy and Lauren just talked about, we live those. Technically, the state of Tennessee, the legislature has done everything it possibly can to keep us as close to slavery, black, white, brown, female, male, LGBTQ, it does not matter. As close to slavery as you possibly can. And that's through voter suppression. That's through corporate takeover of our, of the heads of like our chambers and all of our elected officials, all the way down to having a minimum wage. You know, these things are not separate. It's one big pot of goulash and it's all in there. So when you organizing against these powers, like, you know, this whole thing of self-care is good and all, but it's unrealistic when you really jump into this pot and you're trying to take it all apart. You know, when we started Stand Up Nashville back in 2016, the first thing that we tried to take on was the airport. It was $1.6 billion expansion. And we were like, man, yeah, we're going to go get a community benefits agreement with them. And we were sitting down with the people at the airport, right? Like, we got our butts handed to us. Like, that did not work whatsoever, you know, but we learned from that. And from there, we went and we started looking at, like, one of the reasons why we had issues is because we couldn't name where our public dollars were going, right? So we started looking at public policy and how public policy was affecting us here in Nashville based on, like, how are all these developers just getting all this public money? And, you know, how, you know, it's not building pathways out of poverty. Where is it going to? So we passed the Do Better bill, which is the first thing that we passed, which gave us like a report card and a measurement stick, right? And it was helpful for the elected officials in our city council in Nashville as well, because now you just can't willy-nilly pass something. Here are all these questions and these measurements that'll let you know if this company is actually going to be healthy or good for the people it's supposed to serve, you know? And then from there, we graduated to the community benefits agreement. And the community benefits agreement, you know, again, even though it is a private contract between Stand Up Nashville and the developer, the power and the leverage of the organizing was against the elected officials. You know, we're built of grassroots organizations and labor unions, and together we went and organized all our bases, all the people who vote, you know, and we made them go tell their elected officials that, you know, this has to stop. You know, and I think that's been the best place for us to try to enact some change. Even with all the change that's happened, though, we've only moved the needle an inch instead of meters, you know, and which is why I think we're all looking for it to come from the federal level in some type of way. But yeah, that's the best way I can answer as far as what is the importance of organizing. Now, as far as the best model, I think it depends on what it is and what you're looking for, right? Corporations down here in Tennessee are good at stripping, you know, us of our public resources. In Nashville, we ran an austerity budget all the way up to this year. The mayor just released a new budget yesterday. It's decent, you know. He's getting a lot of credit for the work that we did as organizers on the ground, but hey, you know, we getting it. So, you know, but that's always what happens. We had Amazon come in 2018, at the end of 2018, you know, and we are giving the richest company on earth, you know, $15 million for what? You know, and I think they're getting over $100 million from our state. It makes absolutely no sense. Like, we just have to get out of this mindset of that, you know, they're the value or they're the prize. You know, it's like we're the prize. Tomorrow, Oracle, you know, is going to get solidified here in Nashville. It's going to be the biggest infrastructure deal happen. They're bringing 8,500 jobs to Nashville, and people are excited. We all know they're going to move people here to Nashville with those $8,500 jobs, which is going to exacerbate the gentrification that is happening, you know, and we have no idea what's going to happen to the people, you know, at the bottom. You know, Derica Marions, who's part of the partnership, she said a word the other day. I didn't even think about it. She said occupational segregation. So, you know, I got to nerd out, y'all. I actually went and read on it. Found some PDFs. It's serious out here. When you read, you actually do learn stuff. And, you know, there is an actual gap in between who has the jobs of people who are, you know, what do we call entry level or lower level jobs, or the I don't want to say low skills, but you know what I'm talking about. They're actually essential, you know. Through this pandemic, we appreciate everybody who was working at a gas station. You you know, so they're actually essential jobs. But all those jobs are people that were making, you know, the minimum wage, while everybody else who had a degree job was making, you know, 6 figures. Yet, so now we know who's going to get pushed out to the fringes, you know, of the city, or can't live in the urban core. So everything that we do is tied around making sure that we can pull all those things together. I think one of the biggest part of organizing that people misinterpret right now against corporate power is that it's okay to make them the villain. That's who they are. Like, they are the villain of the story, and you need to like accurately place that blame on them. Like anything that you possibly can to show them being very different from the other structures. I think that's another mistake that we made too. We try to be civilized and very polite with the people who are literally trying to keep us oppressed. And I think where we really started to make gains and strides in our organizing power against corporations is when we could clearly separate ourselves who was for the people, who was talking for the people, and who was against the people. And a lot of that organizing comes in base building, on the ground, like actually having people who have testimonies. The last 2 or 3 campaigns that we had that were very successful, and that goes back to the community benefits agreement. The difference is that we took the time to like do the base building at the bottom and bring in like everyday people who were actually going to be affected by this, and let them be, you know, advocates for what was going to happen. That's how I got into this work, as an advocate for my own self, you know, and giving them the power to go to their elected officials and tell their story. It's very hard to like organize against a person who is literally telling you that this could be life or death for them, or this is going to change like the outcome of the quality of their life. And so that has been the biggest thing that we've done here in Nashville, is to try to tie those things together. I would say the biggest issue, I think Nancy just said it, is that the state just has too much power. Like, corporations are not people, right? They're more of machines. These systems, it is an actual case study of systemic oppression, racism, institutional racism, however you want to call it, right? And people always insert themselves that they're going to be in that position, you know, of a person. I'm like, you want to be in a position to oppress other people? Or these, you know, and we have to change the mindset of people of like, what is it you actually want to see out of life? You know, like, we all have the opportunity, if we work together, to build a power base, you know, that can actually push against this and make all boats rise. If not, you're going to end up always kowtowing to the other side. And unfortunately, that happens a lot with our elected officials. And the reason it's being is because it's had so many years and so many years of it happening time and time again.
Thank you for that. I mean, I guess what it's got me thinking, I'm going to open this up, if it's okay. I'm going to open this to everyone, get us into more of a conversation. So what I heard in what you all each just presented is a story about a system where there are very powerful actors creating an entire system to oppress regular working people. And I heard Odessa in particular talk about organizing folks to resist that. I guess the question I have for you out of that is, you know, it speaks to some kind of Odessa spoke to some very deep democracy, right? The engagement of folks, the information of them. So tell me about sort of your vision, your idea about what the deep democracy looks like that pushes back against this sort of systemic, powerful system of run by powerful people to oppress working people. And if I could, I'm going to send that question back to Lauren first to give the sort of partnerships perspective on it. I'm going to go back around the same circle we did before, but feel free to jump in if you got something.
I mean, I think this, I mean, our opinion on the deep democracy is that everyday people, all of us, have the knowledge and the information that we need to be part with others of us in making decisions about how the resources of our cities and towns and counties should be governed. It may not be that I individually have all the answers, but I, with all of my neighbors, certainly have perspective. And so we start from there to say, like, folks, you know, if you want to talk about infrastructure needs, I can go stand out, like, I'm in Philadelphia, I can go stand out on Broad Street, probably ask everybody that walking up and down the streets, like, what would make transportation better? And people will have a lot of insights into that question. So if we know that the knowledge base on like what's needed is rest in people, and we also know that folks engage in strategy about how to manage resources daily, right? You want to ask any working person, especially on how to make a way out of no way. Like, we know people are inventive and creative. So then we have to start with saying, if we know that the capacities are there, then we have to think about, why do we not have structures about them? So when we envision this, we say, like, not only do we not need to start thinking about budgets, not only in terms of the outcomes, about that, instead of, like, as Odessa is talking about, dropping 5 million here, $1 billion there for companies that don't need it, right? For people that are rich, like own mansions with 24 toilets in them and everything, that we're dropping money to give money to these folks. Meanwhile, we're closing down public schools or schools in every city, because I'm sure folks on here on the chat can say, yep, true, in my school district, lead pipes in schools and kids can't drink out of the water fountain. So, or parents are sending snack for a school for all the kids, like all the things that we start to have that we are cheating and saying we're going to give money to things like Amazon versus investing in our neighborhoods and communities and the people that live in places. So that's an outcomes view. But I think rather than just thinking about, like, how do we make shifts everywhere, like in terms of how the money is spent, how do we also think about just transforming how these decisions are made at the same time and growing the capacities of people? Because that's the other part of organizing. It's not only about people get a chance to have their say, but they grow as citizens, not in the sense of the legal sense, but as part of a collective, and their own leadership capacities open up and everything. And I think that gets to the kind of world and society we want to live in, where we have people with the knowledge and skills of how to advocate and talk about the kind of vision that they have for their communities and society, and have actual power to enact that. So the challenge we're sort of putting forth is saying, we need to do both, right? We need to be thinking about how we're building our infrastructure, as well as looking at the results in the immediate term, and really sort of pointing to the kind of government that we do want, which is of us, not in name only, but in practice.
Are we allowed to hop in, or?
Yeah, absolutely. Get in there.
Okay, ditto, sis, everything you just said. That's literally what just happened with the Oracle deal here, right? So we found out, 10 days ago that Oracle is bringing this massive deal. And it's like, hold on, there's been no public transparency around this. We haven't had time to digest this. We tried to put out 20 questions. Y'all know how everyone on here is organized. You try to do. You put out the op-eds. You go talk to your friends who are elected officials. Try everything that you possibly can to stop this, right? So even very progressive people that we help elect and get into office, they're like, this is a good deal. I'm like, yeah, but it doesn't address the things that we need. If we were going to get $175 million in infrastructure, with any of the things that Oracle has decided that it's going to do for us be what we do, like, that's not democracy, right? Nashville we got 31,000 of affordable housing or workforce housing units that need to be built. We've known this since 2017. We didn't probably build 1,000 of them, right? And this is like needed by 2024. We off track. We batting less than 1 on this one, and yet we gonna get a landfill. That'd have been way down the priority list. You get what I'm saying? And so everyone is like, they're gonna do all these good things. And I'm like, yes, but we didn't get a chance to decide it together. And what are the priorities? If they're coming to the city, what exactly is it that is useful if we're gonna give them a 20-year tax abatement? And the same thing, like you said, just goes back to the schools. They like, well, we're going to build our own school in STEM and tech. Like, we don't need your own school. We got plenty of schools here in Nashville. Like, what's the point of you trying to do a school for 11th and 12th graders and they can't read? Like, it makes absolutely no sense. We all know how that's going to get, truncated down to who can get into that school. So, yeah, I agree with you 100%. And we're still struggling to figure that out. That's been hitting me every time someone asked that. It was like, well, we got 3 meetings to have that, and they got to come back before zoning. We'll get them then. It's still not okay with how they put it together. It goes against everything of what democracy is supposed to be. And it happens time and time and time again. So
I want to take this question to you, Nancy. The part of why I'm thinking about it is because when Odessa talks about Oracle, as a person living in California, I think about Oracle, Larry Ellison coming and saying, you're being too progressive. We're leaving your state. because we don't agree with the decisions you're making, and we're going to move elsewhere. And the way it, as you point out, gives like the view. We know then there is a concerted decision to pit us against one another. We don't necessarily recognize that until we have these types of conversations, but it's pitting the people of California against the people of Tennessee. Who is going to race to the bottom fastest? How do you see that in the work, and what do you see as the way to push back against that way of sort of organizing on the right and building out a program?
Yeah, so interesting that you're representing the state leaving and then the state getting the corporation. So this is absolutely a deliberate strategy on the political right and the corporate right that has been going for a long time, but got much more self-conscious from the 80s forward. And so, yeah, when we talk about the race to the bottom, this is not accidental, coincidental, technology driven. No, this is a strategy. They also use big words for it, competitive federalism. And so what they've done is take advantage of the structure of the Constitution, you know, with state powers and local powers, et cetera, and manipulate the incentives of, say, a mayor, right, or a governor. Like a mayor or a governor wants states jobs for their state. They don't care if they take a big wage cut from the other one or if they give up their schools. They just want to get that reelection in the next electoral cycle. So it's a really, really big problem, as you've all identified so well. And I think the answer to it is, like with most things now, organizing, right? So one phrase that I've heard many people who are doing good work use is organizing or democracy beyond elections, right? So getting out of this mode of thinking democracy is something that we mobilize for, you know, every 2 years or every 4 years to elect people, and instead starting to really build in, like Lauren was saying, you know, like what some people once in the 60s called prefigurative, you know, but like participatory budgets, which is part of your other report, where people actually engaged in the work of self-governing and making choices about budgets, which, as Reverend Barber in my state says, a budget is a moral document, right? A budget tells you who's being prioritized, school children and people with healthcare needs, or corporations that want, you know, 40-year tax abatements. So, so organizing in a consistent way, whether it's at the workplace or in communities, I think is critical. And I think we can also think much more too about things like having precinct captains in every legislative district, people who know their neighbors, who know the issues their neighbors care about and know how to activate them. I was in Arizona where they were doing an amazing job with that in Maricopa County. And that's what we need to do. So like, as Odessa was saying, to try to get to more of a situation where people aren't blindsided, you know, citizens, by what's going on behind those closed doors. And if they do announce a deal like that, where you have more and more people ready to spring into action to create that accountability. And if I could even just throw a question into our midst, I'm very intrigued about this Uber dimension. And I think, because that's also a way, you know, there's so many people who are organized in cities who are doing great work on living wages and community issues and stuff. But there's people like me, you know, who are like, whatever, teachers, professionals who don't know about stuff. And I know so many people who use Uber and Lyft and don't think about what they're doing, right? And so I sort of think exposing some of that could be important to opening up the conversation about what's going on in state legislatures. I do want to say too, one more thing about the organizing. COVID taught a lot of people, reminded us that we need each other, right? So we're seeing much more workplace organizing now since COVID, more strikes, you know, just quickie strikes and work to rule things. So I think that principle of like Lauren was saying, kind of living and practicing democracy every day, you know, not just thinking it's about elections, is critical to solving these issues.
I want to get into that, and I'm going to sort of also take this question out of from one of our audience participants. So what it speaks to me is that there's this question. So you were just talking about, you know, people are organizing. Odessa talked about organizing. Lauren, you talked about organizing. All of these are spaces where people learn how the system that they live in works. And so one of the questions is, what does it look like to give civic education a broader sense of civic education or doing democracy all the time? And I think part of the reason that question arises is because, as our questioner from the audience said, we teach people to vote, and that kind of feels like the beginning and the end of how you're supposed to participate in democracy. But when Odessa talks about a budget, or when Nancy talks about having precinct captains, it sounds to me like a different way of thinking about how we talk to people about how to participate in democracy. So just wondering what your thoughts are about that. And does anybody want to take that question?
Lauren or Odessa? Yeah.
Odessa, do you want to?
Yeah, I will. Absolutely. I think that's one of the things that we learned through the pandemic. We pushed really, really hard on changing public policy. We pushed really hard on getting the elected officials that we want into office, right? And because Nashville is a blue city in a red state, and trying to have progressive voices that sound like us. Yeah, everything was still happening, and I think the pandemic was a reflection of not only, healthcare and race, but, we suck at accountability for, how we handle stuff. And at Stand Up Nashville, I didn't want us to be one of those organizations that always gets, they get moral victories or, doesn't address, 400-pound elephant in the room, however that saying go, or whatever. And it's like, how do you go from being transactional to transformational? And I was at one of these, what do you call it, the LTAs, at PWF be having like these long-term like agenda things, right? And all these smart people be saying words that make my head hurt, but I do be thinking about them, and that was one of the things that Lauren and several other people brought up, is like, how do you become transformational? And when I looked at the scope of it, I was like, we have 79 boards and commissions in Nashville, Tennessee that wield a whole lot of power, and we absolutely missed it. And in the pandemic, we schemed up a boards, commissions, and leadership institute, another connection with the Urban Institute that we got through the partnership, and like built a curriculum. And the thing was just to like then go do it and attack that. And we obviously hitting in the right place, because now we got all type of white people mad at us. And that's always a good indicator if you're doing something right. So I mean, you're absolutely right. I think that, hitting in those spaces that we really don't think about is the place that you organize now. Because now we're getting people that look like me, talk like me, think like me, share perspective, not same skin color. Because also, we'll pick and choose people of skin color who don't have the same shared perspective, as me. So we made sure that we, had a arduous, a rigorous application for people to make sure that they were nominated and accountable to a base, some type of community base. And we're changing people's whole perspective and expectation of what it means to sit on the board and commission. They just can't go under the radar anymore, which is also now popular education, because now people who don't think about what the planning commission is 100% thinking about how it affects their life.
Can I jump in on this? I think it's such an important question. And I think Odessa just really brought home what the stakes are, that we need this, what people sometimes call popular education. And like, I also teach the history of social movements in this country, and every single social movement that had a big impact had its own ways of educating people, right? Of teaching members, of developing their leadership and their knowledge and their confidence. So, I mean, you could go to abolition, you could go to populism, the labor movement, the civil rights movement, and freedom schools. If you want to change the world, you need to have these tools, but you need to have them in a form that's accessible. Like Odessa was saying, like not too many, the words that would, make your head hurt. You need to have it in a language that is, the language of the people who are organizing. And I do want to just recommend one resource, which some of you probably already know about, but maybe others don't. The Forge is an online journal started by some folks from the Center for Popular Education and from some other, Popular Democracy and some other groups, but it's a journal by and for organizers across different spaces. And it's an incredible range of stuff, like people reporting on campaigns and what worked and what didn't, or interviewing people who are looking at, whatever the issues are about local power or national or even international. But I think that could be great too. And then, like at the beginning of a meeting, have like an educational thing where people read a short article like that and get to talk about how it might apply to where they work. Because I have to say, I'm seeing that, like, since Democracy in Chains came out, I've been well, until the pandemic, traveling around the country and speaking to all kinds of different audiences, but it doesn't matter who you talk to. You know, it can be like Greenpeace on the environment, or social workers, or nurses, or community organizers, or on and on and on. But everybody's saying, oops, we really forgot about popular education. And as Mariah put it, civic education, right? Helping people understand where the power lies, how the process works. So I think the more that we can build that into all we do, the more leaders also develop in the way that Lauren said, where you get, you know, more confidence and more sense of your own capacity to make things happen, if you feel like you know what's happening.
I think Odessa and Nancy covered like most of the points I want to make. I want to just, the one little, you know, additional 2 cents I want to throw into the mix on this is I think 2 things. One, just I had a very brief stint thinking about education things, and adults learn differently. And so there's just thinking about popular education. Civic education doesn't need to be like just a classroom thing. So one of the ways that when you get older, you learn things is through the act of doing. So it's thinking about like how, if we are picking apart a budget in real time, or trying to understand if people's issue, like why are the schools underfunded? Why, like here in Philadelphia, we had a heat wave. Why is there no AC? Why are the buildings heating up over 100 degrees? Well, that's live in that moment. You have a moment to start walking through how the school budget's set, how construction's decided, where is the money going, right? So that's an open moment to have a civic education about that is live and connected to work that people are doing at the same time. The other thing I want to say about this is that, especially, you know, the portal of looking at budgets, it's one big way. And we're talking full budget. We're not talking participatory, like here's $1 million to either do a mural or something. Here, we're saying the whole billions of dollars that cities have under their resources, we think we should be, as organizers, as progressives, flinging open those gates and looking for every way possible to bring in the voices of, you know, the millions of people that collectively own those resources. That's the tax base of the place where people live. We can think about that there's an official channel of like, perhaps we have city governments that are open to that and we can partner. But even in the case where we have folks that are hostile to the idea of, you know, the audacity of the people that elected them having a say, we can create our own channels. I think similarly, this is me thinking about my labor organizing, like you don't wait for the boss to decide, oh, did the boss say we can have a meeting amongst us as workers? No, we have a meeting because we want to talk about stuff. We have a vision of how our workplace should be, what we want out of things, and what we want to see as the way that things work around here. And we start having our earlier conversations. So I think this is a moment to think about both of those and think of that's not a substitute for the education aspect, but it is a part of educating because it's the act of doing it and engaging in it. And that is also how people grow and learn and gain capacity.
Yeah, Lauren, I'm not sure if it's a substitute, but I would say if the work that we do at CPI, we find that it's the better part of the sort of popular education work. To your point, you know, we faced a hostile county government, and they wouldn't even hold meetings. They would not even hold public meetings to discuss the budget. So we said, that's fine. We'll have our own meetings. We will talk about what your budget is. And actually, it's so powerful to do that. And if you start from that place of asking people, what do you want to know about this budget? So people ask us this question. We never told them what to believe about policing in this country. But they ask us the question, where does most of the money in the budget go? And you show people where it goes. And then you say, is that delivering, you know, and then they ask themselves the question, does that deliver what I want in the world? And if it doesn't, then they begin to have a conversation that no one in power wanted them to have about how their money was spent and what is actually effective policy at the end of the day about those expenditures. I'm thinking, sorry, yeah.
Can I just touch on that? Because I think that's an important point that I didn't make earlier. It's like we could also link the reason why we have so many people incarcerated in this country, the reason why we have such a growing, expansive, oppressive policing system is in part related to this corporate capture of governance. as well. There's profit being made off of putting people in cages. There's profit being made off of, running people through the mill of tickets and all the other forms of policing. And again, our favorite company, Amazon, is also in the middle of this with Ring doorbells and all the police contracts that they had on it.
Could I just add one really concrete illustration of that and that problem? Odessa, when I was in Nashville, I don't know, sometime back with Together Tennessee, and somebody was at an event that they had who said that Tennessee had the first for-profit prisons in the country. They apparently launched that industry in Tennessee. And she said that what they look for when they decide where they're going to cite a private prison is the number of kids who aren't reading at grade level in the 3rd grade. I mean, it just makes you want to weep, right? I mean, it's just so evil and so cynical. And that again comes to those budget questions. Like, you want to stop those prisons, like get that money transferred into making sure that every kid is able to read at grade level. But that, I mean, when we talk about the mentality of the people that we're up against, I think that really illustrates that the kind of people who wouldn't be trying to help those kids read at grade level, but instead would want to extract and exploit the fact that there was such inequality in a community.
You better talk that talk, Nancy. That's exactly what, I wasn't going to say, Kyra brought it up earlier. I worked at Napier Community Center. When I first got to Napier, it's in the most impoverished hood in Nashville. These 3 or 4 white boys was in the center every day. I thought they were just very nice individuals. I thought they was, Christians always walking in and wanting to hoop and make connections. That's what I thought they were, right? It took the principal at the elementary school to say, no, they work for Core Civic, which was CCA at the time, the prison that you're talking about. And it's like, you in here interviewing my 2nd and 3rd graders? I got kids who want to be astronauts. They want to be firemen. They want to, play in the NBA, but you're marginalizing their future right now, And it turned my stomach. And I think that's one of the points too, when I really started to pay attention to things that were outside of your everyday life. Because at that point I was just happy I got a promotion and not really thinking about how to be a civil servant. So you're exactly right.
I have 2 questions that I'm excited about everything. I want us to talk for another 2 hours if we could, but somebody's telling me we have to end at some point. I guess one of the questions that came from one of the audience members is the question of what about using the referendum process as a lawmaking process that we could use as a hedge against gerrymandering, against lobbying, against all the things that currently happen in the structure. We have this direct democracy referendum process. I've got some thoughts about that as a Californian, but I would love to hear what you all think about that process.
I'll start because mine's probably going to be the shortest answer. I think it depends on where you are. So in Nashville, we've used the referendum process to try to get good things. And that's how I found out about preemption, because the state comes in and interferes and, steps over it, And we've also been fighting tooth and nail to keep some referendums because the opposition can use them as well to get rid of things that we need that are good municipalities for everyone. And that's happening as well here. So I think it depends on where you are because it can be a headache, so.
Yeah, and the other side really funds them, and I'm sure Kyra can talk about that. Some of the awful, famous ones from California, whether it was the tax limitation or anti-affirmative action or all these other things that are funded by these corporate bad actors and then hire impoverished people to go and canvass against their own best interests. It's so deeply cynical. But I think that those campaigns can, and as Odessa is saying, if you choose them well and you know what you want to do, they can be important in, again, this popular education to focus an issue and get people talking about something. So, some of the questions that were raised in the question, we can't do much about because there's Supreme Court decisions right now that would need to be changed, or constitutional amendments to change the landscape for the Supreme Court decisions, like on corporate money and politics. But people like for End Citizens United, there's a national group that's done a lot of really good work to expose corporate money and politics by campaigning to get a referendum against it. And also in Michigan, a citizens campaign against gerrymandering actually ended up bipartisan because everybody hates it. Nobody wants captured seats with, elected officials choosing their voters. Like, everybody can smell that that's wrong. So there was a very successful campaign in Michigan against gerrymandering. There's actually a movie about it, whose name I can't remember right now. But anyway, so they can be helpful. And I think it's just like everything else, you think about what's strategic and the best use of your resources.
I co-sign everything that's been said. I would also say that I think we need to think about, when we're running referendums, not only how is it maybe doing a block or stopping something, but how is this building capacity for us to continue to advance? So when Odessa was talking about LTA or a long-term agenda, that sort of casting forward and really saying, here's where I want to, here's where we're trying to really get, here's our agenda, here's our point of view of how society should be functioning, is in part to be thinking about, as we're fighting and doing our little, advances or blocking the other side, that we're also constantly thinking about that in relation to the long term, right? So if we're running a referendum or doing referendum work, how is that either helping our base grow, right? Is it gaining something that we're able to export to other regions? Is it going to position us in such a way for a later fight? But just really thinking about those questions as well.
So we're getting near the end of our time together. And one of the things I want to if I could just wrap up something I heard you all say. What it says to me, the answers that each of you gave, is that it's not about whether a referendum process, whether we should have it. There's no replacement for people actually engaging in democracy. Wow. Because if we don't get 100% involvement, we don't get involved, it doesn't matter. We're going to have to be on the ground, because to Nancy's point, in places like California, the other side, if we're not well organized on an issue, they will use that process. They will make sure there's low information. They will spend lots of money on commercials, telling people that, black is white and white is black, and they will pull tricks. So the thing that we have the power of, that I heard at the beginning of this, is that we are the majority. Our perspective is the majority. And that's why a deeply democratic process is the answer for us. All right, so we're gonna wrap this up. And I thought that I would just open it to you. What are the last things, what is the message you want to have land coming out of this panel? What is the most important message for you? And I am going to ask that we do it in this order. This is me and the Southern girl and me. I'm going to ask that we have Nancy go first, companies first, then Odessa, and then we'll have it all summed up with our fearless leader, Lauren. So that works for everyone. Okay.
That's great. Well, thank you. And thanks again for having me and hosting this discussion. I've learned a lot, and it's really, really such important stuff. I think the last thing I would say is that sunshine is really important, and accountability, and that can do many of the things that we've talked about in terms of alerting people to the problems, exposing the bad actors, the villains, as Odessa said, when you got a villain, let people know that they're a villain, and also, holding feet to the fire. So one last resource I thought of is this, Judd Legum it's called Popular Information, but he's been doing great work, or the team there, about corporate bad actors, and particularly the ones that were funding the politicians behind the insurrection and doing a lot of stuff like that. So I know that in a number of states, accountability campaigns have been hugely important, and it doesn't even take that much. I've been told, set up a Facebook site, a kind of Save Our State or something, and just really showcase who is funding the worst actors in your state and what are the impacts on the communities that you represent. And so I think that's a really, really important way to go.
Oh, my bad. I should have zoned. That was my cue.
I know, that's what happens when there are good people on a panel.
I would say the most important thing for people, especially when you're taking on corporate power, you gotta know yourself. You can't come into organizing against corporate powers and trying to find yourself. You gotta be sure about who you are, because they're gonna test you on it. This work is going to test you on it. It's not easy. And you do have to, you sacrifice something. I don't know what that sacrifice is going to be, but you do sacrifice something, and you should be sure that this is what you want to do before you even try to take on one of these type of campaigns. And then the second part about it is that I would say the most important part that I've seen through the 6-7 years that I've been doing this is that like your internal organization is probably more important than trying to get out into the streets, because all that is there and is ready. It's usually because you don't have the capacity, or you're trying to reinvent a wheel that's already built. You know, I'm really thankful to have the partnership. You know, I don't have to be the nerd. We got a bunch of dope nerds who's ready to get out the street and do their thing. It's important for me to be a conduit and a connection with people so they understand the urgency. That's my job, and I know my role in it, right? So if you're gonna organize against these corporate powers, like be prepared, like know your role in it, and just be really good at your role, because you have allies who are gonna do all the other pieces, and trust that y'all can put it together and do something big.
I would, yes to all. And I also want to say that I think that organizing is about the possibilities of what can be, and we can't let the limits of what is in front of us today limit our demands or our visions. And so that, I think, is another important ingredient here, is that yes, corporate interference is daunting. And it's as part of the suite of deregulation and corporate control success and attempt to control government is daunting. But I don't think that we can settle just for chipping away for pieces of it. Our ambitions have got to be that the majority of people, which are not billionaires, which are not corporate CEOs, which are not chairmen of boards, should be governing and determining the future of how our cities, counties, states, and country is moving.
That was incredibly succinct. I want to thank you all for being here. I am going to tell everyone in the audience a secret, that at the Partnership for Working Families, being a nerd is definitely not an insult. It is one of our highest compliments, up there with being a badass organizer. It is what we do. So I want to thank you for being 3 badass organizing nerds on this panel today. I appreciate you so much. Thank you everyone who attended this panel. If you enjoyed this, please keep following the partnership's website and social media. This is what we do. You will hear more from us in this work. We appreciate you taking this time with us, and we hope you learned something that inspires you in your work and moves you forward. We look forward to your partnership and your hard work. Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Good
Thank you,
job,
Kyra.
Kyra. That background popping, girl. You even matched it to your lipstick. That look good. And I ain't never been called a nerd a day in my life. I appreciate that.
You were in here talking about austerity. You were in here using the words too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is that we got to treat of the Southern humility. Nancy, thank you.
It was very nice to meet you, Nancy.
Thank you. Oh, bye, y'all.
I gotta hop off. Bye, everyone.
Everybody.